It is working now, apparently, yeah. I can't hear it properly in mine. I can hear now. I'm getting thumbs up around the room. Right, okay, let's make a start. So I'm Jim Ski, I'm chair of IPCC, and I did actually learn about 5 or 10 minutes ago that I'm actually chairing this session. So it will be very well organized and systematically put together. The challenge, one of the challenge we're trying to address within IPCC, if we could get the screen up. I'm told I have to point this very, very accurately to get it done. The topic of this session is essentially about how we treat spatial detail within IPCC. And there's really two parts to that. Into what detail can we look at things spatially? And the second part is actually how do we cluster countries and put them together into regions? And this was a difficult topic for us during the 6th cycle. So just a reminder on how we operate within IPCC. This is our purpose: to address on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis, etc., the scientific and technical socioeconomic information, both about climate change and climate change action itself. And the assessment process involves going from a variety of sources, which include obviously peer-reviewed, internationally available data is at the top of the list, but we may also draw on statistical data from different sources, more grey literature, which gives us a greater discretion about how we cluster data and put it together. And we then turn that into knowledge, findings, we look at the strength of scientific agreement, and we can identify knowledge gaps. Now, the challenge we have, and the way we're going to organize this session, is that each of the 3 working groups, a representative, is going to present the way that they carried things out in the 6th cycle, and also highlight some of the challenges and opportunities that are there for the 7th cycle. But in the 6th cycle, Working Group 1 focused on climate impact drivers and geographical kind of regions, or regions with different characteristics. Working Group 2 looked at ecosystems, human systems and regions, and the Working Group 3 focused on systems, sectors and regions. And what I want to flag up before we start is that each of the regions was characterized in a different way across the 3 working groups. And this is one of the challenges we want to put out for the discussion section: is more harmonization possible? So we actually have 3 contributors from the working groups. We have 2 veterans of the afternoon, because I think Nana Klutze and Bart van den Hoek have already performed, as it were, in the cities session previously. But to give us some energy and new blood, Kate Calvin is coming along from Working Group 3 to finish the picture. So I wonder, Nana, if we could move over to you first of all, to introduce the Working Group 1 material. It's up and down.
Thank you, James K. If I have my slide up. So as James K introduced, I will focus on the Working Group 1, where we have come from, a few lessons into the future. So I will give more specific information on how we define regions, geographical regions, and then we had other regional definitions as well. So this is on the physical basis. So in the 6th assessment report, we had assessed regional information. Apart from the global information, we had assessed also regional information. And we looked specifically at analyzing the climate characteristics of these regions did some check the differences and did some comparisons. We looked at impact, and then we looked at vulnerability. So we produced information from the various literature on the impact and vulnerabilities as well as the characteristics. So we had, does this work? Okay. So we looked at the globe in totality from different sources of data. Um, the satellite data for observation. We had used regional climate models. We had used global climate models in our assessment. And then we had used reanalysis data as well. We looked at the past information, we look at the present, and then we look at the future. So that is in terms of the regional information and, of course, in relation to the global information. We looked at the land characteristics, we looked at the ocean, we looked at the polar regions, we looked at urban areas, and then different latitudes. So we looked at the high latitude, and then we looked at subtropical regions as well. So we had different definitions for the region in the Seventh Assessment Report. In terms of geographical locations, we had divided the regions into, climate regions. So in the next slide, I'll show you. And then specifically for the geographical allocations of the region, we had the polar region, tropical region. So we have specific climate information for these regions and how temperatures, precipitation, and other climate variables vary or compare in these regions. We in the next slide I'll show you. So we had reference regions, as you can see, and have these different divisions of the region for very specific regions, and then there's the topography for the global region. So I'm doing this comparison to show you how we have gone specific to the regions and also what we considered at the global scale. So on this side, you see at the global scale, we look at the topological regions where we look at the monsoon regions, polar regions, and then other climate characteristics over the regions, and then the regional references as well. We looked at the ocean regions as well um, in the working group one. So information over the oceans, and we had divided the oceans also into these specific regions. More specific information. So the concerns, of course, as Jimsky said earlier on, um, we're looking at these different region definitions, how we move or translate into the AR7. We need to describe a new spectrum and the regional consequences as we assess uncertainties in the Seventh Assessment Report. So, climate change impact, sea level rise. There are a lot of changes going on and happening. We need to also consider coastal regions, especially in the Seventh Assessment Report. Sea level rise and impacts become very significant, and then the threats that it poses on coastal cities is real. So we have consideration on that. Biodiversity loss is another concept we're thinking. Should we have regional divisions alongside biodiversity loss compared to what we did in AR7? We have extreme event impacts, how different regions are being impacted by extreme events, frequencies and intensities of, let's say, heat waves or drought or heavy rainfall. So do we do regional differences or divisions according to how these regions will be impacted by these events? So we need to understand also the landscape of agriculture, water resources, and then human settlement. So these are all compounding issues we're thinking of going into AR7. So the last figure here is showing the assessment of new scenarios, warming levels, and physical limits. We're considering policies that will be evolving based on the previous reports, including the R6 report, and actions that government are coming up with and global decisions alongside. So that should inform our new scenarios ahead of the global stock take as well. And then again, we ask ourselves, what are the new regions, or what do we mean by the region? So with all the different aspects of climate, we're thinking through in the seventh assessment report how to redefine regions, if we should still stick to the 6 regions, or change depending on how the climate system is changing with all these different definitions of the region. I think these are a few from the working group 1. So we want to have a better assessment. We want our reports or assessment to be more informative and be usable by the, the government. So we were looking at new scenarios, we're looking at emission trends, the regional climate. We want to have high resolution projections or not, depending on what governments and experts will also bring on board. Information for climate services. AI has been a big topic and discussions emerging, and we want to see how we can apply AI in our climate research as well, especially with the working group 1. Extreme events attribution, we think a new method. Tipping points is an issue. How do we address this effectively in the seventh assessment report? Of course, there are cross-cutting issues, and we in the seventh assessment report we had handshakes of the 3 working groups. We're still considering cross-cutting issues and then cross-cutting sector issues as well. So we believe that we have both the global issues and the regional issues uh, well considered in the seventh assessment report from the working group 1 perspective. So this picture shows flood and heavy rainfall event. Sorry, flood and heavy rainfall event, and this is at a very large scale, but we can still have some information there. Is this the kind of information we want to see in the seventh assessment report? Should we go very high resolution, much higher resolution than what we have here, or not? These are questions we asking and discussing among the working group 1. In all, we want the report to be usable by all. I think that's the end. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nana. I suggest we just move straight on to working group 2.
Yes, thank you. Also, of course, Work Group 2 had a lot of regional and similar coverages like regions, sectors, biomes. Is this the... Yeah, okay, this is ours. There was quite a, probably compared to Work Group 1, there is quite a larger range of information that has also been assessed in the report. It's dealing with impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation. So you also enter the realm of policy documents, national inventories of impact, the status of emergency systems, etc. So that there was a bit of information. There was, of course, a lot of observations that are both have a global scope from model experiments or observational data sets. But a lot of local data has been inserted in these assessments as well, because we come to a very, proximity to where people live and where nature is, etc. So that is, I think, in the source of information, the challenges are quite large to reconcile quite a wide variety of types of information to be combined. You see also increasing uptake and production of remote sensing information and aggregators of other non-conventional types of information, like business data reports. It's been scarcely used in AR6, but it's probably going to be a bit more used also in AR7. But this is one of the topics I think we could spend some time on in this discussion. Then I guess also Work Group 2 of course had a very strong orientation towards societal and environmental sectors or systems or subsectors, subsystems. The report structure or the chapter structure aligned a couple of, say, system sector-oriented chapters like water, food, infrastructure, health, well-being, communities, and poverty livelihoods had a separate chapter. And of course also had a geographical orientation. So it had continental chapters like what is shown there, Africa, Asia, etc. And then there were a couple of cross-chapter papers produced on topics like biodiversity and more to say the environmental realm. So we need to cut the whole collection of dimensionalities into all kinds of subsectors, and that is going to be another challenge also in the AR7. Interestingly, the structure of the reports, if you look at the outline, it is actually quite a nice, concise overview of how it was arranged. And so it had these regional chapters, and it had these more sectoral chapters, as I alluded to before. And it had then a couple of cross-chapter papers to actually make connections between the two. And in addition, actually outside of the AR6 report itself, there were a couple of regional fact sheets produced, although inside of the report was also a regional chapter allocated to another atlas, but not an interactive atlas as we had in Workgroup 1, but more a static set of layers and approaches was there as a sort of an annex. But yet, I think in AR7 we are really, getting ourselves into the continued challenge, I guess, to produce a report that allows easy navigation of many different dimensionalities into the matter of concern. And there is a lot, of course, calls that we need to appreciate and respect and pay attention to, say, the regional dimension. There has to be some kind of a region-specific identity or characteristic that we need to come to. But if we go to the level of local impacts, we can, of course, all appreciate that even within a big region like Africa, or even if you make the sub-regional domains like the Workgroup 1 did, there's so much diversity inside that region that needs to be addressed also specifically. So it cannot be only region by region and then expect that someone says, okay, I'm in an African city and so I go to Africa and then I know everything what's there to be known about my city. So I think one of the discussions I really would like to get into is how we could produce a structure that does not allow, say, a regional scope, but also maybe like in the previous session, those who were here, we were talking about cities and then talking about, how cities could be arranged in order that they are alike, that there's elements that are alike. That can be, say, in physical sense. We can distinguish high, low elevations. We can distinguish coastal to inland. We can distinguish dry to wet regions, of course. Of course, societal sectoral systems, we can still look for, say, what is the food system, the water system, the biodiversity system, maybe the infrastructure and the industry systems. Socioeconomic, the kinds of economies that are there, and maybe also the kind of development history is there. And yeah, or some other kind of clustering. So there is still the question, I think, is every report again and again, what is actually the best structure to make sure that we navigate towards the scale where the assessment makes sense. And that is only very rarely done at purely the regional system itself. Another discussion we are going to address at the scoping meeting in Kuala Lumpur in December is about this atlas. I was happy enough to, together with Nana, to be involved in the production of the interactive atlas from Working Group 1. And so I now am, allocated as co-chair of Working Group 2. And of course, it's quite dear to me to bring a bit of that experience also to Working Group 2. But already in AR6, there was the aspiration to try to combine. And we did try to we produced a couple of kind of fact sheet prototypes, I would say, where we would combine the interactive atlas climatic impact drivers information with, for instance, demographic information or GDP information, whatever, to maybe inside these atlas maps to make more overlays between different types of information that could become also more specific. And I guess that is, to be scoped again. Can we extend that atlas also to make an interactive atlas for Working Group 2? Could we think about vulnerability patterns that we could bring into an atlas. There was a vulnerability map made in the in AR6, but in this case, the vulnerability information, of course, is very difficult to regionalize. What is seen here is actually more like case studies or anecdotal storylines of how that vulnerability actually is built up, but it is very local specific, and of course there isn't a way to aggregate it to high or low vulnerability levels at, say, the continental scale. But to become really meaningful, you have to come into quite a bit of granularity, which is the title of this session. Impact observations, of course, is getting better. And then also when Nana was talking about impact attribution and etc., that is, I think, very interesting to think about what kind of impacts can be mapped, geographized, that we could put in an area, in an atlas like that. On ecology, there was in the interactive of in the Workgroup 2 Atlas, there was already this figure that looked at the migration of ecological subsystems. What's called climate velocity was the terminology. This is a display of the oceanic variant of that. Of course, there's a lot of geographical ecological information that we could also think of to be integrated in the interactive atlas. This is really an interesting topic. What information is there, and what kind of combination features make sense to try out and to actually enrich the assessment in the same way that the interactive atlas in Workgroup 1 did. It wasn't there as a product itself. It was intended to enrich the assessment of the other chapters, of course. And finally, I'd like to revisit also the cities outline that we got approved and will work on now, where there is a chapter 5 that is dedicated to city case studies, with the intent to illustrate where all the different attributes of climate information, climate governance, climate finance, climate impacts come together at a case-by-case basis to try to synthesize. And that is what that chapter 5 is about. And I can think that also a digital analogy of a repository of case studies could be maybe even linked to the atlas, or could be developed as a standalone digital product. There is examples around there, existing examples, and also examples being developed currently that actually make digital repositories of case study material. There's an increasing volume of different digital products being developed and also commercially exploited. There's businesses that actually create story maps. You can, as I know an example in the Netherlands. There's a small company, a municipality that would like to make a graphic display of what actually climate change is about. They go to the company and they make nice maps of urban heat island effects and number of people and the kind of housing and the distance to medical facilities and prototypes of extreme events. Very, very valuable information to bring climate change very close to the practice, to the point where it makes. So that is also an idea, where narrative structures are actually used to combine different graphical features to come to a story of what actually the cause-effect chain is. Other kinds of data visualizations can, of course, be considered as that is prototyped in all kinds of other domains. So those are the topics where we departed and where actually the discussion could be leading to. And I consider this, or we consider this discussion as part of the scoping process that will soon start formally with the scoping meeting in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you. And I think I hand over to Kate directly.
Thank you, Bart. So as Jim mentioned, I'm co-chair of Working Group 3, focused on mitigation, and I'm going to give a similar type of information to what you've heard about Working Group 1 and 2. We get the slides. So I'll start a little bit about what was in the 6th assessment report. First, in terms of sources of information, in Working Group 3, there's a lot of information that's based on country-reported data, whether that's emissions inventory, energy use data, or other types of inventories. Similarly, there's a lot of information that's around how countries report pledges, policies, plans, either to the UNFCCC or to their own, national communities. So there's this country-level data that we have. Then there's also modeled data that is used quite extensively, and this is ranging from local models, whether they're city or other national regions, to national, regional, and global modeled information. And in the global realm, those global models often divide the world into some number of regions, but that number of regions varies from one model to the next, and how they aggregate countries is very different from one model to the next. And so it's a very diverse pool of regions within global models. There's also information that is geospatial in nature. And I think in AR6, what we saw, this mostly was around agriculture, forestry, and other land use mitigation potential. So there are a lot of people that use models or other data sources on a geospatial area extent and can look at potential for things like afforestation, reforestation, or bioenergy on a map, and can do that in a geospatial nature. I will say there's now, I think, a growing literature that is broader than just agriculture, forestry, and other land use using geospatial information. So there's a lot on renewables, both renewable potential today, as well as how climate might impact renewable potential in the future. And that has a very spatial character to it that is, different depending on whether you're in a cloudy region or a not cloudy region, and how that might evolve in the future. There's also a growing set of satellite-based data products that are available that can look at things like emissions or changes in land use or land cover that might be relevant in Working Group 3. And so I think there was some geospatial data in AR6. I think that there is more in the literature now. A lot of the work that happened in AR6 when we thought about how to divide the world focused on systems and sectors or subsectors. And so there were chapters around energy, agriculture, forestry, and land use, cities and settlements, buildings, transport, industry, as well as a cross-sector chapter that brought some of that together and picked up some of the things that don't neatly fit into one of those sectors or systems. So we worked at looking, sub-global information was a lot based on systems and sectors. When we think about geographies, there's different ways to think about geography in the Working Group 3 context, whether it's institutional, national, subnational, or international. And I will just say on the institutional front, we do get more questions that are subnational, whether they're city scale or companies, about what can I do, what's relevant for me. And I will come back to that in a second. But then there's other things there. Within the AR6 report, there was one figure in the summary for policymakers that subdivided the world into geographies. And this was focused on historical emissions. And it looked at sort of continental and subcontinental regions. So Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and Caribbean, Middle East, North America, South Asia. I won't read the rest. They're all on there, but there are about 10 of these regions. And we reported historical emissions and information around emissions at this 10 region level. And I will just note on that this is very different than the way Working Group 1 and 2 did it, as Jim mentioned at the beginning. So we used a different context. When we looked into the future, the primary division of the world was focused on sectors and systems in the summary for policymaker, and less on geographies. But as I mentioned, we're getting more questions now. So when we give talks about Working Group 3 report or about climate change in general, you'll also often hear people ask, what can I do? And depending on the context they're asking that question, they might mean, what can my country do? What can my city do? What can I as an individual do? And so I think a question for us going forward into AR7 is, how can we provide policy relevant yet policy neutral information across a wide variety of topics, geographies, and contexts? And that policy neutral is very important for the IPCC. We need to be policy relevant, but not policy neutral, and we need to think about that as we are assessing things. And so just to give some ideas of the sorts of information that was included in AR6, where this context or differential nature across geographies came up, there was an assessment of mitigation potential. And in AR6, that mitigation potential was primarily focused on options within sectors and systems. It was all global in nature in the summary for policymakers. But there was a note in that summary for policymakers that costs and potentials will vary across countries and regions. There was a lot of effort in AR6 looking at the implications for sustainable development. So if I implement this mitigation option, what does it mean for biodiversity, food security, water scarcity, the economic dimensions? And a lot of that, we looked at synergies and trade-offs of mitigation across the sustainable development goals, but noted in the figure that does this that the synergies and trade-offs vary dependent on context and scale. And context is very broad there. It could mean the type of geography, it could be the type of implementation, it could mean the place. So a lot of different variances there. There was an assessment of feasibility of mitigation options and pathways in AR6, and it was done across several dimensions, But in the assessment, they noted that feasibility will differ across sectors and regions. And so there is, again, this differentiality that was noted in AR6. And then lastly, scenarios and pathways. There are a lot of national, regional, and local scenarios and pathways in the literature. In the AR6 summary for policymakers, that it focused on global scenarios and pathways, but did note that those global scenarios and pathways have differences in regional assumptions and regional outputs, and we need to look at the global results with that in mind, as well as considering things like equity, which most global scenarios did not explicitly account for. And so when we're going forward into AR7, I think our question is, how can we provide this policy relevant information? How can we think about subdividing the globe? Is it systems and sectors? Is it regions? If it's regions, are those around groupings of countries? Are they around sort of geographic characteristics? Differences between urban and rural, wet and dry, boreal and tropical. All of those differences do impact both the options available and the challenges and benefits that you might face from those. And so just going forward, we want to really hear from perspectives on that regionality. And so now I'll turn it back to Jim.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate. And just to say, as I was a working group co-chair in the last cycle and did Kate's job in the last cycle, there are a couple of things I would like to say before we move into the discussion section. Everybody will then come up to join part of that. The big issue that we had, and this is a working group 3 issue, was how you cluster countries in different ways. And there was a lot of discretion in Working Group 3 potentially, because we have country level data relating to energy, land use, etc. So we have discretion there. So just to say, overall, that we've got potential for AR7. Bart has already mentioned the extension of the interactive actress from Working Group 2, from Working Group 1 to Working Group 2. And I think one of the things that we have to be very interested in is how far we go in spatial specificity in Working Group 1 and 2. We've got a lot of feedback from governments to say we would like much more detail, that the level of detail in the AR6 was not quite enough. And Working Group 3 really has some challenges, I think, in terms of regional specificity. It tended to be quite contentious at our approval, the way that countries were divided up. And I think the challenge for us, but it's not just about physical geography, it's about cultural, geopolitical, economic ties may be important in clustering countries. We're constrained by the practices in the literature which is being assessed, from which we may not be able to move. And as I say, there has been more discretion when it comes to aggregating statistical data. I might say one other thing, which is what happens when you draw a map and what you put on the map. Because there are issues there are territorial disputes out there, and it can be challenging to actually draw a map. And frankly, scientists have thought of all sorts of ingenious ways of representing the world that bypasses this territorial question. Good one at the bottom right-hand corner, what I've crudely called the hexagonalization of the world, which is a nice way of getting around some of these territorial kinds of issues. And just to flag, we are spoilt with choice when it comes to different systems from aggregating countries. I have a wonderful spreadsheet with every country tagged according to each of these different ways of dividing up the world. So we've got the UN regional groups, which is the basis for deciding where COPs are located, which is different from the UN Statistics Division, which does it in a different kind of way. The UN Statistics Division also identifies least developed countries, small island developing states, landlocked countries. Until the end of 2021, it also formally distinguished between developed and developing countries, but that distinction is no longer used. All of that is not the same as UNFCCC Annex 1 and Annex 2. It's not the same as the World Meteorological Organization and the 6 regions it uses. And in IPCC, we've used different categories. We also have World Bank income categories with 4 tiers, which have been argued to be used by some countries. And we have all sort of membership of either intergovernmental or supranational bodies, EU, OECD, etc. And sorry, I couldn't help putting it at the bottom that the way that we may get agreement is FIFA, Eurovision, Olympic committees may be the only way in which we can get agreement on what actually to do. But this is a challenge, you know, I think for Working Group 3 specifically. Now, if I can just make a few more general comments before we finish. I mean, we do have a big aspiration for more working group collaboration in the next cycle. And I think, as you can see from the presentations, there's a lot of work in progress on the question of spatial specificity and regional differentiation. I might add for Working Group 3, the choice to go with systems and sectors was also dictated by harmonisation with the task force on inventories and the source categories that are used there, so we could get these to join up. So the scoping meeting next month in Malaysia is going to be important. And what I think it would be useful from this little session, which I think we would deem to be consultative, to get any views from people in this room on how we might approach some of these issues. And I can't help noting that there are a number of representatives of country delegations here in the room. I won't name them, but they are here in the room. And I think it would be particularly helpful to hear some comments from the user side, from the countries, on how we might approach this. One final point on the sensitivities. I've always had a very cynical view that in Working Groups 1 and Working Groups 2, the question is what people are doing to the climate. It's what climate is doing to people. And in Working Group 3, it's what people are doing to the climate. And that introduces all sorts of other kinds of sensitivities about geographical and regional specificity. You know, people, if it's about what climate change does to you, people always want more geographical detail. But there is great sensitivity when it goes in the other direction, which is why we often go to the global level and use systems and sectors. So I've had my little rant. This was caused by all the challenges that regionalisation caused Working Group 3 in the last cycle. But maybe if Nana, Bart and Kate could join me, and then we can listen to any questions or comments from the floor. Okay, we have three experts here who've been heavily involved in working group discussions. So I think I can see a hand already at the back. So let's go there. Can you pick up get a microphone?
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay, so my name is Renzo today. I am from Brazil and I'm an anthropologist, so happy to see reference to the need to use culture as a guiding concept for regionalization. So, and then at the last point about whether this is a government or a science problem. So my question is whether it would be interesting to consider some of the applied social sciences like political science and sociology as a bridge between science and government, as mentioned there. And the second question is if whether the IPCC or someone had envisioned ways of using cultural regionalization, how that could exist.
Maybe, yeah, why don't we start with you on Bart, on that one? This is a big issue for Working Group 2, I think. We'll get other views as well.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to commit to, say, a political orientation, because that is quite dynamic. It's not a very static view, I would say. But cultural, of course, has a huge diversity indeed that we could cover, and I have to give it a bit more thought, because it's a very good question, but I'm taken by surprise. But I guess what relates to culture is about what, say, historic experiences with climate either climate impact mitigation, or climate impact management, or climate mitigation management, whatever. What kind of historic experience have been there that can be seen as something that is also that can be seen as something that is also can be projected into the future. And if you think, for instance, about coping capacity with extremes, right? It is also demonstrated in literature that harsh conditions give a lot of coping capacity. So it's definitely not the case that the most exposed countries have the largest challenge, because there's maybe more coping capacity. And I guess that's part of the cultural legacy that you should take into account make a good impact assessment and also a prospect assessment. It also probably relates to things like solidarity. There is a lot of climate measures. This is certainly risk management comes down to an materialization of solidarity. We have insurance schemes, we have regulations that may harm some but protect others. Solidarity is not something infinite. There's always a kind of a principle of what solidarity actually is concentrating on. Is it your own generation, your own group, or is it something that is much bigger? And that, of course, sets the boundary conditions for what kind of policy arrangement one could figure for what actually is best feasible for that setting. I guess those are cultural dimensions that are definitely worthwhile in exploring a bit more. Whether this could give rise to, I guess it is a part of a classification, but of course we lose connection with regions. It is not geographical anymore, and it's also going to be quite difficult because in a multicultural society, all these cultures get mixed up. So it should be necessary to assign a cultural identity to, like, a governance system or an economic basic principle. That I don't know how that could be done, but it's a very good comment.
Yeah, just on the first part of your question. So I think, from the scientific and technical side, there are some limitations on regionalization based on the underlying scientific literature. If you're starting from geospatial data, you have infinite possibility because you can aggregate it the way that you want. But a lot of, at least in Working Group 3, the underlying literature is not geospatial. And so that does put some limits on what you can and can't aggregate. In terms of political scientists, I think we do have an aspiration to include a more diverse author pool and knowledge base in AR7, including more political scientists. But I will say, since I am not a political scientist, I don't know well enough how they can help with this, but I think it's a great question to ask.
So I believe, continuing from Kate, I believe the political sciences have the questions that should actually come from the society to the scientists. So in the Seventh Assessment Report, we want to be as inclusive as possible. So we will get them involved, and then we hope to get the right questions to provide the answers for during the assessment.
If I might just add to it, I do think that actually political scientists were among the best represented group of social scientists within Working Group 3, because there were chapters on policies and institutions and international collaboration that sent a very good signal to political scientists. It was the participation of sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists that I think were more challenging, I think, in terms of the social sciences. And I think one other point that's worthwhile mentioning in relation to your question is the degree to which IPCC engages with Indigenous knowledge and local communities knowledge. And we are actually giving more consideration to that in this cycle. There's a workshop on gender diversity and inclusion, which Diana over there knows all about, which will think about how to get more engagement from Indigenous peoples. And then I think I'm proposing a workshop which would be more about the knowledge side of it and how Indigenous people's knowledge gets embedded in IPCC. So I think that's relevant to your question as well. Maybe Barb, do you want to add to that on Working Group 2? Because you've given a bit of thought to Indigenous knowledge, I think.
Yeah, I think it is also part of the discussion we had in the previous session on the cities report, that and what Nana was also saying, we really need to diversify the source of information that enters the assessment. And that was also what we showed. There's so much more information than just geospatial, physical, quantified data. And we need to reach out to that community. So I think it is for the preparation for that expert meeting on diversity, inclusivity. We are looking at what is currently the evidence that we can find in literature, how successful we have been in bringing in diverse views and diverse knowledges, and what can we expect that if we are successful in that, what that actually does to the type of the assessment itself. How could we trace that we would be successful? So it's a bit an open question, and I'm not an indigenous knowledge expert, so I'm curiosity driven to see how we can enrich our own thinking and how that actually would work out. I leave it there.
Yeah, okay, no, yes.
Yeah, so just as a way of assurance, the discussion of indigenous knowledge inclusion has started already during the cities report. So it has started well upfront during the AR7 cycle. So we believe that it will translate into the main report as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That was a question that stimulated quite a response. Any other questions in the room? Yeah, Anna, please. Maybe if you can say who you are and where you're from when you ask, that would be good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Anna Pirani. I'm from Italy. So I have two queries, basically building on what Jim said, how you have a sort of endless list of requests from very different perspectives on, needing more regional information from the IPCC. And in a way, it's an irreconcilable problem, right? And so I was just bringing up two conditions, for example, the dynamics of regions in the future. Like it refers to, for example, Working Group 1 in terms of climate changes in the regional characteristics. Working Group 2, you showed climate velocity, which is a really interesting characteristic that will evolve in future conditions. And in Working Group 3, you often have high political sensitivity among looking into the past, looking into the future, and how country and regional characteristics will change. So how do you deal with a dynamic perspective on regions? And the other question is, can you connect more with activities that would be, say, policy-driven, policy-relevant downscaling that would be done by different communities or regions or nationally? So, for example, by developing frameworks, assessment frameworks, that then regions or countries, cities or communities can then implement robustly to derive more policy-relevant information. I don't know if that makes sense. But essentially enabling a downscaling that would be done by different communities or users, or it could be at different scales, nationally, subnationally, city scales, community scales. So setting frameworks basically and enabling those handshakes to happen for further regionalization, and not trying to deal with it all in the IPCC reports.
Yeah, I think your second question got us into the very delicate issue of typologies of cities, which came up when governments considered the scope of the cities report. There was something in there for everybody. So why don't we just move through Working Group 1, 2, and 3? Maybe start with you, Nana, to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so probably on the very first one. I think it's a challenge and it's a discussion among us as well, and so we open it up for consultation as much as possible. The experts scoping and all of the governments will come in, and so we'll have probably a more befitting definition of regions as it is expected. And then we know also from the city's perspective that governments require more specific information on regions, even at the city level as well. And so it's all part of the discussion going into the AR7, particularly for Working Group 1, as you actually mentioned. We also want to be as inclusive as possible and understand or acknowledge the diversity of the issues. So we have different sources of data we want to consider in the assessment, but as the indigenous knowledge issue comes up every now and then, we hope to also understand from the indigenous knowledge point of view some of these data. We have different case studies, we have heard stories of the observation from instruments, observation from people, and all of that. So we need to consider going forward all of these different or diversity of data and information out there as well. Thank you.
Work group order, yes. Yeah, I like the part of the question that deals with, say, dynamically varying regions. And indeed, you made it clear, and you said also, there are so many ways to define a region. And I think the way we did it here is we have a geographical region, but that's maybe in your terminology, it's not the same as a geophysical region, because like in West Central Africa, desert is going maybe to grow or whatever, or the water scarce areas is going to grow. You can stay within the regions, but I think it's really relevant, to try to overcome the sensitivities that come with typologies. Because we can, of course, understand the sensitivities that come with typologies, because every discretization is another lock-in, is probably affected by some kind of a value proposition, and we need to be sensitive to that. But on the other hand, we also should, if we have a neutral way of at least pointing at this is a group that has commonalities that is relevant to track, and then we look at what the aspect of what actually is changing for this group, but also is that group growing or shrinking? That is the dynamic dimension. And of course, a lot of the projections to the future is that maybe not given conditions for an individual change, but that there's a larger group of individuals that will be exposed to those conditions. So the dynamic nature of what currently is, say, the way we order the world, that is changing, has to be there. But then we need to overcome the sensitivities and avoid a lock-in. It has to be a policy neutral kind of typology. That is, I think, we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question and a hard one to answer, and something that I think we will probably need to revisit at every stage of the process. So at scoping, what can we do? What can we do as we're writing the report? What can we do in the summary for policymakers that makes it communicate? And some of what, when I was just thinking about when you said that, is one of the things is understanding when a finding applies to whoever you are. And I think when you talk about dynamics, that's what I think about, like what is true for a particular place in 2023 when the Air 6 finished may differ in the future. And I think understanding that is the first step. So when would this not still be, relevant for this particular place or geography or type of information? I think that might be part of it. But then also thinking similar to what, related to what Bart was saying, is around, where are there things that are similar versus different? And so that we can really understand that and communicate that in a way that people understand, is this still true for me now?
And I think indeed, when I showed that slide with the different ways of chopping up the world, there were dynamic categories in there, because the World Bank income categories are dynamic and people move. I think it'd be an interesting question whether people move gradually from one category to another, or whether there's a tipping point where it happens suddenly, as when the UN Statistics Division removed the distinction between developed and developing countries, for example, which was sudden. So we've still got a little bit of time left. Are any further questions? While people are thinking, can I ask you a question, Nana, and you, Bart, question? This is a naive Working Group 3 perspective question. Just how detailed can you get in terms of gridded information in the future? Are we talking about 10 kilometers? 5 kilometers, 1 kilometer? Is it the same in different parts of the world? This is I told you, a very naive Working Group 3 question.
Yeah, it is, of course, the safe answer is it depends. No, but we show that there's so much variability here, but I think it really depends. If we go to urbans, we need meter scales to make maps of urban buildings and their carbon footprints or whatever. But and if we are to make ecosystem assessment, we can afford quite a bit coarser, I think. But again, I think there is a kind of a trained warning button in my head that when it comes to pushing for the importance of resolution, I'm inclined to question: is it resolution, or is it like metric resolution, distance resolution, that we should be worried about? Because there's a lot of reducing distance resolution to tackle a problem, which comes with a lot of economic cost for doing model calculations, but in the end, 90% of that increase of resolution isn't actually bringing in any new information. And I think we need to be critical about focusing only on spatial resolution. There's so many other dimensions of resolutions that make way more sense. And that I like to challenge the question on a case-by-case basis. Sorry to be so safe on this.
Thank you. So I just had the same thinking that the figure it's gone. Can you hear me? Maybe mine. Okay. So the figure I showed in the last figure I showed in my presentation was actually from a paper by Joyce here. She could give more perspective, but linking it to your question, one moment. Linking it to your question, we see that the figure shows flooding, and it's at a resolution where we can get enough information that should flooding of the eastern part of Africa. Is that kind of information enough for us to take decisions with at the regional level? And is that what you mean by your question? If it's by resolution as Bart as already explained, we don't have the same level of information across the world. It's different from different places. And then if it's about observation, we don't even have observation for everywhere in the world. If it's about the models, we don't have the same level of resolution for every region. And so we're going to have very different information, but again, it depends on the context and what we want to communicate. If you don't mind, I will want Joyce to give a little bit of insight into the figure that I showed on the screen.
Yeah.
I
couldn't help but noticing the attribution was Kimutai 2024. So Joyce,
Thank you so much. I mean, I was also surprised to see my figure on the on the slides. Yes. So just to say that I've really enjoyed the discussions here. They're very very informative. Really happy to be here, to be listening to this, and I think this is the right discussion we should be engaging in as we prepare for AR7, and especially adding into the scoping process, which is coming very soon as well. So I think on I have a question, but also just on the comment. I mean, you've put me on the spot, Nana, but that's fine. It's the when you. So what I think would be interesting, so in this paper that we looked at a whole region in East Africa, and we were looking at a flooding event that happened in a particular time. But I think something very interesting would be, is that information representative of the region? And what exactly are the questions you're asking, and the questions that you want to answer? Who are you addressing? Is it a particular sector? Is it a particular community? How useful would that information be? Who are you targeting? Are you targeting certain groups, policymakers? What levels of decisions are you targeting? So those are the sort of the different level of questions and answers that you need to provide, and also ask yourself when you're like designing a report or work or sort of what is the usefulness of the information that would come out of that. But I think the most important thing would be, and that is and that's what I mean. Anna really asked a very, very, very good question, and and I think just to add on that, and with the discussion, just like complementing what Anna asked, and just to adding to this discussion, the question that I wanted to ask is, are we starting to think about how do we want to have reports that sort of are space for qualitative assessments, information, very granular information. So that is, it's not entirely quantitative, right? So it's not just looking at, so for East Africa, this region in East Africa, it's not all the regions have like data stations that I could use, but there's still very relevant information in the localities, in the small scale, in regions where it can be very useful for other levels of decision or for decision making, right? So where is the space to have that information? And I know it's because the way we've all sort of, the way IPCC sort of siloed reports. So we have working group 1, 2, and 3 looking at very different things. It might be very difficult to sort of figure out or even understand where that can be possible. But I think if we can start thinking about this in the scoping, saying, okay, how can we integrate some of the qualitative information to go into our reports to tell us, to give us more information about regions where they are data sparse regions in terms of the quantitative information, so that we are sort of supplementing those quantitative information with qualitative assessments. And for this particular event, so we're looking at attribution. So what we've done, for example, it's just an example that we use in the sort of the studies that we do, is that on top of looking at the attribution study, looking at the role of climate change in these particular events, we also go ahead and look at the elements of vulnerability and exposure that actually modulate the level of impacts that are experienced by communities. Because that's another additional layer of information that will be very useful for decision making at that level. So it's just on top of saying, okay, we see this much role of climate change in this event, but what does that, how are sort of the impacts that these communities have experienced really sort of modulated by the local factors? And what are sort of the interventions or policy decisions that need to be made to support the communities, even in terms of adaptation and all that, incorporating the information that comes with the climate analyses with the qualitative assessments that can be done. Yeah.
I think it would be worthwhile getting a response on that, actually, Joy. So let's try. Yeah, qualitative information.
I think that is a great question, and it's something that we really need to think through and talk about. And I will say I have high hopes for the workshop that Jim mentioned to help us move that needle forward, because we did have, at least in working group 3, quantitative information and qualitative information were largely separate. And I think there's some interesting, either filling in the gap or putting, I'm going to use the word bounds because I'm jet lagged and it's probably not quite the right English word, but something, to help us reflect on the quantitative information. I think you can bring some qualitative in that way, but how to do it, I think, is a part of the conversation we need to have. I am aware of some emerging literature where some of the quantitative modelers have brought in qualitative experts and social scientists and tried to think about that. But I think we need to look at that a little more systematically and think about it, because there are data gaps. There's also things that quantitative analysis can't capture, even when you do have a lot of information. And so trying to figure out how to use that, I think, is a great question and something that we need to focus on. And I don't know if Jim has thought through how to do that in his workshop or not.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the level of difficulty in this. I'm picturing the polygons that we had reported in the Seventh Assessment Report, and Jimsky has showed how we also group regions with the polygons a few moments ago. So we've had a discussion in the past, thinking about the data scarcity from these polygons also as well. So the question is, if we have a polygon without information and it's like gray, so this is what you're asking. Can we have a narrative that says We don't have quantitative data, but we have some qualitative. So that kind of space is what you're looking at. So it's maybe difficult, but we can have a good discussion around it to provide. Yeah, sure.
And indeed, we have this multiple lines of evidence reasoning, where there is qualitative data can, of course, substantiate quantitative data. But I think what's interesting indeed also in bringing in, say, social scientists or behavior scientists or perception experts or whatever into the quantitative world, I think one qualitative element that probably doesn't come out of a computer is actually the filter through which you actually interpret or aggregate quantitative information. And your example of a flood thing, if you were to express that in terms of an impact, like a societal impact. I'm from the Netherlands. These people know how to calculate actually flood risk, and they calculate mean annual damage by just counting the amount of damage that is occurring from the flood. But that, of course, gives a very different distribution of where the damage or where the effect is high than when you would actually normalize that mean annual damage by the number of years people would have to work to repair the damage, right? And because then, of course, then the lowest earning areas stand up as the highest impact. And that is, I think, also qualitative information, or actually qualitative awareness, that we can bring in a bit more systematically, that we question the quantitative frame that we do. But I'm not sure whether that is what you mean with qualitative, but I think it relates to how we look at the world in a qualitative sense.
Okay, thanks. I'm just looking out to see if there are any more questions from the floor at this stage. It's been a long day for me. I don't know how long your day has been. So I'm just testing how much appetite there is in the room for more questions. If nobody is raising their hand, could I just turn one more time to the panel and ask them about their hopes and expectations for the scoping meeting? What do you think are the key kind of regional spatial questions that need to be addressed when we get to Kuala Lumpur next month? Because I think that will be quite helpful. I mean, I've heard many useful things already just in the last half hour or so for us to think about. But what are your kind of hopes and expectations? So, no challenge there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I expect that even from our own perspective, we have so many kind of definition and considerations. So we should be as flexible as possible to accept, put in the baskets every information that comes, and then we still throw it out there for aggregation as much as possible. Look for commonalities, look for differences, and then we find a way of defining these regions. But it's going to be difficult. We don't expect it to be any easier. But then it's something we have to do. It's questions we have to answer. So we do it together. Thank you.
Bart?
We go by working group again. And I'm not sure if that is the greatest hope or expectation, but I have to think often we are committed to provide more concise reports, to actually try to bend the trend towards ever increasing up to 29.4 kilos was AR6 or something like that. And I really would be very precious if we could go to about half the weight, I would say. Which means that I'm also dear to improving recognition of people that have to take decisions. I think that's what action-oriented is. So some way to constrain, I guess, the material, or at least I would like to avoid that if we were to bring in even more direction from which we could approach, how we distribute the world. I would be very dear to avoid duplication too much, that we come up with even thicker reports. I think we need a bit of discipline to constrain ourselves in what we actually sacrifice if we prioritize something. That would be my dearest outcome, that we as a group agree on that we have to maybe compromise a bit, but this sectioning is probably best targeted to get people directed to the point that they want to see from the report. That would be my hope.
Yeah, I think for me, when I think about the scoping meeting, we're going in very much in working group 3 with wanting to hear the experts and what they want to do in terms of structure. And I think depending on how that conversation goes will dictate how much detail we need to resolve about regionality or dividing the globe at the scoping meeting versus what could wait for a lead author meeting or beyond. And again, we are very open to any possibility that may emerge from the scoping meeting. And what we're doing now is trying to engage a wide variety of perspectives so that we can understand what are those questions, what are those information needs. And so then I think what I want to get out of the scoping meeting is to hear those views, to bring that in and to figure out what do people need and what is a way that we can provide that so that you can find yourself in the report and get the answers that you might need going forward. And I don't know what that means in terms of structure or what it means in terms of regions. And I'm very hopeful that the experts will bring their very rich perspectives to that.
Yeah. Well, okay. Thanks a lot for that. And just to say, I think, of course, the other geophysical aspect that Bart has picked up is the physical weight of the reports that come out. And I can't remember, I think you're about right on that. But Bart, can I just say, you have the biggest challenge, because Working Group 2 was 3,000 pages in the last cycle. Working Group 3 was the shortest by just a small amount ahead of Working Group 1. So I think you've got some big challenges there to actually work on that. Maybe I can just end up with one anecdote, because you know, I had the opportunity to look at much more spatially specific information on a trip to Japan about 3 weeks ago, where I visited a company called Weather News International, and they had a business model by which they were getting much more specific weather forecasts down to wind speeds in individual streets. And the way they did it was they had their customers, if the customers phoned in some weather information, they gave them a couple of gold tokens. And when they got enough gold tokens, they sent them a webcam. And they could put the webcam in the window from which Weather News International then scraped weather information and processed it using machine learning and artificial intelligence. It was a brilliant business model, but you can bet nobody is going to see that data because it's all part of a private business model, but it shows just what can be done. So I think this is a really, really important topic. We're going to need to really get our teeth into it in the scoping meeting. But what I'm pleased to say, very, very obvious picture, all our working group bureaus are actually got their thinking caps on, thinking how to approach it. So I have high hopes. So just a thanks to all of the panel, Nana, Bart and Kate, and thanks to you for some very provocative questions. So we'll conclude there.